curious observers who had wandered in expecting routine traffic cases and minor violations. At the center of it all sat Judge Frank Caprio, calm and composed behind the bench, his black robe hanging neatly, his hands folded as he reviewed the file in front of him. To anyone who had watched his courtroom before, the scene was familiar. Order, dignity, and an expectation that everyone who stepped forward would speak honestly and respectfully. What no one in that room knew was that within minutes, those expectations would be tested in a way that would leave the entire court stunned into silence. The clerk called the defendant's name, a man in his mid-30s who stood abruptly from the second row. His movement was sharp, almost aggressive, as if he had been waiting not just for his name to be called, but for an opportunity to unload something he had been carrying for a long time. He walked to the podium with heavy steps, shoulders squared, jaw tight. From the moment he reached the microphone, it was clear this would not be an ordinary exchange. He didn't adjust the mic or glance respectfully toward the bench. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood, eyes locked on the judge with a look that bordered on defiance. The charge itself was simple enough: a traffic violation, failure to appear for a prior court date, and an outstanding fine that had been ignored for months. On paper, it was routine. In reality, it was about to become anything but. Judge Caprio looked up from the file and spoke in his measured, even tone, asking the man to state his name for the record. The defendant complied, but his voice carried a sharp edge, a hint of sarcasm that immediately rippled through the room. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge noticed, of course. He always did. But he didn't react. He simply nodded and continued. As the judge began to explain the nature of the charges, the man interrupted, not once, but twice. The first interruption was brushed aside with a gentle reminder to let the court speak. The second came faster, louder, and more pointed. Yeah, I know what this is about," the man said, waving his hand dismissively. "This whole thing is a joke." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Disrespect, especially open disrespect, was rare in this court. People knew better, or at least they usually did. Judge Caprio raised one hand slightly, not in anger, but as a signal. His voice remained calm. He reminded the defendant that the court deserved respect and that he would have a chance to speak when it was his turn. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the message might land. The man shifted his weight, exhaled sharply, and nodded, but the tension didn't dissipate. It coiled tighter. When the judge finished outlining the case and asked the defendant to explain why he had failed to appear previously, the dam broke. The man leaned closer to the microphone, his voice rising. He blamed the system. He blamed the court notices. He blamed his job, his schedule, the city, even the police officer who had issued the ticket. Each sentence came faster than the last, words tumbling over one another, dripping with frustration and contempt. And then, almost casually, he crossed a line. "This court doesn't care about people like me anyway," he said, his tone biting. "This whole thing is just a joke." The room froze. Even the clerk stopped typing. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Remarks like that weren't just complaints. They were a direct challenge to the authority of the court. Several heads turned toward Judge Caprio, waiting for his response. Many expected an immediate rebuke, perhaps even a warning of contempt. But the judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his gavel. He simply looked at the man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Sir," said Judge Caprio, his voice steady but firmer than before, "I'm going to ask you to slow down." He explained that everyone who came before him deserved to be heard, but that respect was not optional. The man scoffed, shaking his head. That small gesture, dismissive and arrogant, spoke louder than words. It was clear he wasn't listening, or worse, that he didn't care. The defendant interrupted again, this time louder, his voice echoing off the walls. "With all due respect, Judge, this is a waste of my time." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh no." It was the kind of comment that could change the course of the hearing in an instant. Judge Caprio straightened in his chair. The warmth that often softened his courtroom demeanor gave way to something more resolute. He wasn't angry, but he was unmistakably authoritative. He reminded the defendant that the court was a place of law and order, not a stage for personal grievances delivered with disrespect. For a split second, it seemed as though the warning might finally register. The man hesitated, lips pressed together, eyes darted briefly toward the gallery, as if suddenly aware of the audience. But then he laughed, not loudly, but audible enough for everyone to hear. A short, derisive laugh that cut through the room like a blade. That was the moment everything changed. Caprio paused again, letting the silence stretch. Silence in his courtroom was never empty. It was deliberate, purposeful, a tool he wielded with precision. When he spoke next, his words were measured, but the authority behind them was unmistakable. He explained, calmly and clearly, that the court was a place of law and order, not a stage for personal grievances delivered with disrespect. He reminded the defendant that he had come here because he had ignored the law, not because the court had singled him out unfairly. The man tried to interject again, but this time the judge stopped him with a raised hand and a firmer tone than anyone in the room had heard all morning. "You will listen," he said, not loudly, but with a weight that silenced the room instantly. The gallery leaned forward almost in unison. Even those who were staring at their phones moments earlier now watched intently. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable sense that the balance of power had been clearly, decisively reasserted. Judge Caprio spoke about responsibility, about choices, about how ignoring court orders and then blaming the system was not an explanation, but an excuse. He didn't insult the man, he didn't belittle him, he simply dismantled the argument piece by piece, with facts, with logic, and with a calm authority that left no room for rebuttal. Each sentence landed firmly, not as an attack, but as a correction. The defendant's posture changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. The defiance drained from his face, replaced by something closer to discomfort. He shifted his feet, glanced down at the podium, and for the first time since stepping forward, he stopped talking. The judge had not raised his voice, yet he had completely reclaimed the control of the room. But the hearing was far from over. Judge Caprio returned to the file, flipping a page deliberately, as if signaling that despite the outburst, the process would continue. He explained the potential penalties, the fines that had accumulated, and the consequences of continued non-compliance. His tone was firm but fair. This was not punishment driven by ego, it was the law, applied as it always was. Then he looked up again, directly at the defendant. "You came into this courtroom today with a choice," he said. "You could explain yourself respectfully and ask the court for consideration, or you could do what you've been doing, push back, blame everyone else, and show disrespect. So far, you've chosen the second option." The words hung in the air. The defendant swallowed hard. His earlier bravado was gone. He nodded slightly, though whether in agreement or resignation was unclear. The judge gave him one more opportunity to speak, reminding him that this time it would be without interruptions or insults. The man opened his mouth, hesitated, and then began again, this time slower, quieter, more careful. Outside the courtroom, no one knew what was unfolding inside. Inside, however, everyone understood they were witnessing something more than a traffic case. They were watching a lesson in authority, restraint, and the power of respect, one that was only just beginning. The defendant stood at the podium now, in a noticeably different state than when he had first approached it. The tension in his shoulders had softened, his chin no longer lifted in defiance but angled downward, eyes flicking briefly toward the bench and then away again, as if unsure where to settle. The courtroom itself felt altered too, as though the earlier confrontation had cleared the air, leaving behind a charged stillness. Every person in the gallery sensed that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of the case, but the lesson the moment would leave behind. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the bench, his posture open but resolute. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, calmer even than before, but it carried an unmistakable authority, the kind that does not need volume to command attention. He asked the defendant to continue explaining his situation, reminding him gently but firmly that this was his opportunity to be heard and that the court was listening now. There was no trace of sarcasm in the judge's tone, no lingering irritation from the earlier remarks, only a clear boundary and an expectation of accountability. The man took a breath. This time, he did not interrupt himself. He spoke about his job, about inconsistent hours and missed mail, about how he had assumed the fine would sort itself out if he ignored it long enough. As he spoke, his words no longer came out as accusations, but as admissions. He didn't look proud of them. He didn't look angry either. He looked tired. Judge Caprio listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his eyes steady and attentive. The gallery noticed something important in that moment. Respect had been restored, not through force, but through control. When the defendant finished, silence returned to the courtroom. It was a different silence than before, not tense, not shocked, but reflective. Judge Caprio glanced down at the file one last time, then closed it slowly, as if signaling that the facts were now complete. He looked back up at the defendant and spoke with deliberate clarity, explaining that responsibility did not disappear just because life became inconvenient. He spoke about how the court was not an enemy, not a machine designed to punish people unfairly, but a system that relied on cooperation and honesty to function properly. Then came the turning point. Judge Caprio addressed the earlier disrespect directly, not angrily, not dramatically, but honestly. He explained that words spoken in frustration could escalate situations unnecessarily, and that disrespect toward the court only harmed the person standing at the podium. Authority, he said, is not about power for its own sake. It's about maintaining order so fairness can exist. The defendant nodded again, this time more clearly, his expression showing understanding rather than obligation. The judge outlined the penalties as they stood, the original fine, the added fees for failure to appear, and the possibility of further consequences if the behavior continued. But instead of immediately imposing the maximum penalty, he paused. The pause was intentional. Everyone in the room felt it. This was the moment where judgment could go in one of two directions. Judge Caprio explained that while the defendant's conduct had been inappropriate, the court also recognized genuine hardship when it was presented respectfully. He reduced the fines, set up a manageable payment plan, and emphasized the importance of compliance going forward. His voice was firm as he made it clear that this was not leniency earned through confrontation, but consideration granted after accountability was accepted. The defendant's reaction was immediate and visible. His eyes widened slightly, his shoulders straightened, and he let out a quiet breath he seemed to have been holding for a long time. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, sincere, and, most importantly, respectful. There was no sarcasm this time, no edge, no attempt to challenge the moment, just gratitude. Judge Caprio nodded once, not triumphantly, not smugly, simply acknowledging the exchange as complete. He reminded the defendant one final time that the court expected follow-through, and that respect was not something demanded for ego, but required for justice to work. With that, he wished the man luck and called the next case. As the defendant stepped away from the podium, he moved more slowly than before, no longer storming back to his seat, but walking with a subdued awareness of the eyes still on him. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, some nodding quietly, others reflecting on how quickly the tone of a room and a life could shift when authority was exercised with restraint. The courtroom returned to its rhythm. Papers shuffled, the clerk called another name, but the impact of what had just occurred lingered. Those who witnessed it knew they had seen something more than a legal ruling. They had seen a reminder that authority, when grounded in calm and fairness, does not need to shout to be heard, and that even the most disrespectful moment can be redirected into a lesson that lasts far beyond the walls of the court. And as Judge Caprio continued on with the docket, composed and steady as ever, the message remained unmistakable. Respect is not optional, accountability is unavoidable, and justice works best when authority is exercised with wisdom rather than anger.